Bonjour, hello. Bienvenue à cette webinaire de la chaire sur la décarbonisation. Moi, je suis Mark Purdon. J'espère que tout fonctionne au niveau technique. Ce webinaire va se dérouler en anglais, mais on est vraiment content ici cette fois parce qu'on va parler un peu des résultats de la vente aux enchères du marché du carbone qui lie le Québec et la Californie. On a la participation en cours de professeur Charles Seguin de l'UQAM, mais également Dr. Colin Murphy, qui est un chercheur basé en Californie à l'Université California Davis. Je vais juste changer en anglais, if that is okay. So thank you to our participants for participating in this webinar of the Chair in Decarbonization. We're happy to have the participation again of Charles again at the Department of Economics here at UQAM. And we also have a colleague, Dr. Colin Murphy from University of California, Davis. I don't know if you wanted to say hello, gentlemen, but the floor is maybe yours for a brief introduction.
Yeah, well, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us in this webinar. It's the second one I participate in, and we hope to make this, I guess, a regular occurrence for each of the auctions. Yeah, it's great to see people attending.
Hi, and so yes, I'm Colin Murphy. I'm the Deputy Director for the Policy Institute for Energy, Environment, and the Economy at the University of California, Davis. Technically not a professor, though I appreciate Charles and Mark trying to give me the promotion. Didn't quite have the stomach to make the tenure track, so I'm in a staff position. But we work closely with the Institute of Transportation Studies. We do a lot of work on climate change policy, and between this position and work I did with an environmental and climate-focused nonprofit, I've been working on climate market issues for over a decade now.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Maybe I'll just ask Colin or Charles to give me a thumbs up that you see the PowerPoint slide on the screen.
The title slide.
Yeah. So essentially, we're just going to proceed through a bit of a PowerPoint, and I thought it's really just a very basic PowerPoint. And we'll have Charles and Colin to comment as they see fit. I believe, Colin, you may have to go within a half hour or 1 hour. So,
yeah, somewhere between. Yeah, I've got probably about 45 minutes, I think, before I have to jump to my other thing.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being online with us today. We thought just a bit of an overview of how we're going to proceed. It's sort of what we've done in the previous webinar that we ran earlier in the summer. Just a brief overview of what the of how the auction system works for the carbon market linking California and Quebec, the prices that were obtained in the August 2022, last few weeks ago, the auction then, and then also the proportion of allowances purchased. And then maybe a bit into potential explanations and a conclusion. So this is sort of a bit of a busy slide, but I thought it would just be important to recap that there are different rules for how emissions allowances are being allocated under the cap and trade system, under the Western Climate Initiative rules, which are harmonizing those between Quebec and California. And Colin and Charles, leap in if you want to add something here. But essentially, we have 4 auctions a year, so every quarter. And there's importantly to perhaps most important for the moment is there is an auction price floor, and that is the price that the governments of Quebec and California initially offered the emission allowances at. And that started at $10 US in 2013, and it's an increase to by 5% each year, plus inflation. So it's been gradually increasing, and we'll see it's about above $20 Canadian right now, but I'll get to that in the next slide. Another thing to just highlight is that there's a carbon price ceiling. We're well below the carbon price ceiling. Under the initial rules of the carbon market, you had an allowance price containment reserve, which was a surplus amount of allowances were put in reserve in case that a price became too high. But this would be reformed, and I apologize for the typos, since 2021, at least in California, and I believe it's the same in Quebec. So there's a firmer price ceiling set at $65 US, which started $65 in 2021, which is also increasing 5% per year plus inflation. And I'll just finish with just a bit of an update on free allocations, and then I'll turn the floor to Charles and Colin. When the carbon markets was initiated in 2013, over that initial 2-year period, 2013-2014, there was actually a high amount of free allocations being allocated, about 80% freely allocated in Quebec. But in 2015, the carbon market was expanded, and most of those were new coverage included auctioned allowances. So the proportion of free allowances actually declined to 20%. There's been a lot of discussion about the extent of free allocations, and also the Quebec government is now in the process of developing new regulations for the 2024-2030 period, which I think are being discussed right now, and I would assume something similar is taking place in California. I don't know if Charles or Colin, you have anything you would like to elaborate on there.
Well, what I can add to that is that the big change that occurred in 2015 is including the oil distributors, right? And well, also the natural gas distributors. And all these fossil fuel distributors don't get any free allowances. So the initial period in 2013-14 was only for industrial emitters. And the government was really concerned there would be like reallocation and emission leakage of some of these industrial emitters. So that's why there was a lot of free allocation given to these emitters, but there wasn't that concern with the distributors of fossil fuels. So that's why the percentages changed so much from the initial period to the later periods starting in 2015. And then for the new plan to reduce free allocation, there's going to be there's a formula that depends on the world emissions covered by a carbon price and the level of that price across the world. But what's most interesting is the introduction of accounts to develop new technology. So some of the free allowances will have to be put to the auction. The companies will have to kind of buy their free allowances, but they will keep the money, but the money will be set in a special account to be used only for technology development to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I think the government is concerned here that for now, official numbers are not out, but I think the writing is on the wall that Quebec is importing a lot of permits from California. So we might not be investing enough in developing new technologies to reduce our domestic emissions. So I think they want to promote domestic reductions with these special accounts to invest in emission reduction.
Colin,
Sure. Coming from California, where our market is quite a bit oversupplied of permits right now, we're very thankful for the ability to have Quebec absorb some of that surplus and help us get the price a little bit off the floor. Sort of two thoughts there. First, like Charles mentioned, the revocation of free permits to oil emitters was a major shift in the market dynamics in Quebec. In California, one of the political compromises necessary in order to get the cap and trade market extended to 2030 was to give refiners to continue their free allocation of permits to cover the process emissions at refineries. So it doesn't cover the embodied carbon in the fuels they sell, but it does cover the process emissions. So it's about 20% of the total sort of carbon footprint of producing transportation fuels, a bit less actually, since some of that is oil, is allocated to refiners for free, and that's going to continue to be the case until 2030 at least. In terms of the long run sort of strategy in California, right now we are in the process of going through what's called the scoping plan creation. The scoping plan is developed about every 5 years in California, and it ends up being California's master climate strategy document that covers really all of the programs, policies, and economic sectors that play a role in us achieving our long run climate targets. We anticipate the scoping plan being complete and adopted by the end of this year. Once that happens, that's going to kick off a round of rulemaking at all the regulatory agencies that control parts of the climate portfolio, and the cap and trade market is likely to be one of those. Those rulemakings will then adjust the constituent policies to get in line with the broad strategic guidance set forward in the scoping plan. So we are likely to see probably 2024, just because it seems like there's other policies with rulemakings that are already queued up for 2023, but it's possible they could start the rulemaking a bit early. But there is going to be a rulemaking anticipated for the cap and trade program. We're not exactly sure what that's likely to do, whether it's going to make any significant changes to future allocations or not. There's an awareness that the California cap and trade market is a bit oversupplied, and I'm using a bit very, very generously here. There's almost, I think, a full year's worth of permits banked up at this point. So there's a number of reasons to think that it would be most efficient to reduce future allocations in order to kind of soak up some of that oversupply. However, there are some political winds pushing against the cap and trade program. In this case, rather than coming from business or fossil fuel industries, which is where they've originally come from, now it's primarily environmental justice and disadvantaged community groups who are sort of concerned and a bit upset that the cap and trade program has not led to the kind of reductions in major stationary source emitters like refineries that they were hoping for, and they would prefer other regulatory approaches. So I haven't seen anything that makes me think that CARB is likely to, adopt a significant tightening of the program. I think they are, in general, trying to de-emphasize the program as part of the climate portfolio and emphasize more direct regulations and other approaches. However, it is still clearly part of the portfolio. It absolutely has a role in the scoping plan, and will probably need some tightening in order to achieve the role that CARB has laid out, but it remains to be seen whether there's sort of the political will to do that.
Great. Okay. So now I'm just going to move ahead with the actual prices attained at the last month's auction. And we have a distinction here between the current vintage and the future vintage. I don't know, Charles, I think you're probably better placed to comment on these numbers.
Yes, well, I think you have the graph that show the temporal evolution. I think the most notable thing here is that the prices are above the floor, which they have been maybe since late 2021, when the economy is started recuperating from the COVID shock. We see two different tendencies, right? The current vintage, the 2022, is a little bit down from its highest point that it has reached in the previous auction in May, which was about $40. Now we're down to $34. I'm going to use Canadian dollars, I guess, for my part. I think that's what you have in the graph, yeah, Canadian dollars. While on the contrary, the future vintages, in this case, the 2025 one, is up a little bit from where it was in May, and significantly up from where it was at the beginning of the year in February, where it was at the floor. I think there's two different dynamics here going on. I think what changed significantly from May to August is big interest rate increases from both the Federal Reserve in the United States, that two big hikes in mid-June and late July, and the Bank of Canada in early June and mid-July, that is starting to slow down the economy of both jurisdictions, and I think emitters are anticipating or feeling that slowdown, so they reduce their demands for the permits, which brought the price down a little bit. We could see that a little bit in the number of participants. I think there were 10 fewer entities that were allowed. So we don't know if they actually submitted bids, but we know the list of people who were allowed to submit bids to the auction, and there were 10 fewer entities in August than there were in May. So maybe a little less people interested in that auction, which might also explain the decrease in price. For the future, I think there's a dynamic that happens most years, maybe not in 2020 because of the COVID, which is usually the demand for the future vintages is lowest at the beginning of the year when the floor price has just increased, because it's increasing every beginning of the year at that 5% inflation rule that you mentioned. And then the demand slowly builds up over the year. I think that reflects the fact that there's this once a year adjustment. So if you're buying these future vintages to hold them as an investment, as a speculator, and it's probably more interesting to wait later in the year to buy them when the constant action of inflation has eroded a bit the real value of the price floor. So that's the dynamic we're observing this year. So I expect this to be the same, to continue to have the price of the future vintages to increase in the next auction in November, and then fall back down once comes February, especially because inflation was so high, or anticipated to be so high over the year 2022. They'll probably announce the highest increase in the floor price for 2023 that we've ever had in the system.
The one thing I'd add to that, I think there's a dynamic that may not have been reflected in these prices because it might have been too fresh at the time. But over the summer in the US, we had the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act at the federal level. And then in California, there was the adoption of the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule, which commits California to a phase out of internal combustion engine vehicles. So no new internal combustion engine vehicles will be registered by after 2035. So this is a strong commitment to phase out the use of petroleum over a kind of defined time frame. It's not going to mean there's zero petroleum sold in 2035. There's still going to be a significant fleet of vehicles purchased prior to then, but that does clearly put the writing on the wall for large-scale petroleum consumption in California. And so it's possible that some of the downtick might have been groups assimilating both of these things, which are likely to provide reductions in emissions under the California greenhouse gas inventory, which is sort of the basis by which cap and trade permits are measured and required. I suspect that as various financial and research and modeling groups continue working to go and demonstrate the impact of both of these measures on California's emission inventory, it will show that there's likely to be a continued sort of reduction in emissions from factors exogenous to the cap and trade market itself. And so that's likely to continue putting kind of downward pressure on the market. And so again, this argues in favor of CARB needing to reduce future allocations to account for the expected, sort of non-cap and trade emissions trajectory if they want the price to stay off the floor in any significant amount. But again, given the kind of political headwinds, it certainly may be that CARB is comfortable having the cap and trade basically ride the floor, for the foreseeable future, and continue to basically function as a carbon tax rather than a cap and trade market system in that case.
Maybe I could just
add to that the timing for now is the same in terms of banning the registration of new internal combustion engine vehicles in Quebec. It's 2035, although we're in an election right now. So I think some of the parties are proposing an earlier date. I think California is a major player in the car market, so I think being aligned with California is probably a good idea in terms of the supply of models that are going to be available here. Because if we go our own route, we might not have a sufficient supply because we're not a big pull in that market for electric vehicles.
Just maybe if I could ask the two of you to comment on what happened in 2021. Where I think you could argue from the graphs here on the screen, the both current and future vintages were basically stuck to the price floor. But in mid 2021, now we're about what, $15, maybe $10 above now, but at one point we were about $15 above the price floor. What happened in 2021? That, if there's any comments on it.
I think the main thing that happened is just coming out of the COVID restrictions, like in 2020, you could see in the graphs that, things were getting a bit above the floor in 2019, even a little bit in early 2020, but then you get to the May auction of 2020, which is just after the COVID struck in March. So everything grinds to a halt, emissions, fall down significantly. And the demand is low, and then that keeps being low until the economy starts to get back into gear and really kicks in. And I think we could see here that we started getting off the floor at the auction of the second auction of 2021, and then there was a bigger jump at the third auction of 2021. So my read on this is really the big spending boost that there was with all that money injected in relief for the effects of COVID and the economy overheating in 2021 and 2022, leading to the inflation that we know now.
I agree that is probably the largest factor. The other thing I'd say is I think by 2021, really in some ways a bit earlier, but I think COVID may have suppressed this effect. It was clear that California was committing to very ambitious long-run climate policy. It was committing to meeting the 2045 carbon neutrality pledge, which was an executive order by the previous governor. So there were some questions of, would the new governor really make that a focus, or would he sort of keep it there nominally? He wouldn't overturn it, but not necessarily commit a lot of resources. And there were some significant investments in climate made during the budget process. The state really sort of received the go-ahead to move forward with the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule. And so I think the general expectation that California was had decided to fully commit to ambitious climate policy, to meeting both the 2030 and the 2045 targets, gave a lot of people reason to believe that these markets were going to continue to be important, and that climate policy was going to continue to receive focus, and it wasn't just sort of going to languish off as the funding mechanism for a few projects and otherwise have no real significant impact on climate policy.
Great. I'll advance to the next slide, which is on the proportion of allowances purchased. The current vintage and the future vintage. And not to put this in a historical perspective, here is the trends for the two vintages. I hope you're able to see that on your screens.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Anything leap out at you?
To me, it's largely the same thing, just the expectation that these markets are going to continue. I think the fact that we're not seeing allowances sell out, pretty consistently, there's allowances remaining, means that most participants are probably fairly confident that if they have an unexpected shortfall, they can go to sort of spot market or secondary market purchases to meet any shortfall. But that there is an expectation that that climate policy is going to matter, and so maintaining an ample reserve of allowances becomes important. I think when you look at the future allowance auction and see that big sudden dip in 2016, that largely occurred due to political uncertainty in California, when a number of participants were starting to wonder whether California would be able to get the political coalition assembled to reauthorize the market beyond 2030. And so at that point, with that uncertainty, I think a lot of participants really started trying to draw down their reserve. Everybody who's in the market wants to have a reserve as a hedge against future price spikes. I think everybody, when it wasn't certain the market was going to exist, wanted to draw that down. And so I think that dip turned out to be unnecessary because the market was extended. And I think now we're seeing groups realize they want to continue having this reserve of permits as a hedge against price spikes. And beyond that, because the floor goes up at 5% plus inflation, it's functionally a relatively guaranteed rate of return. That's pretty nice. Like if you're going to be putting liquidity into something, and you're sure that this market's going to exist at least through 2030, and carbon signals is going to extend well beyond that, 5% plus inflation ain't a bad place to go and park some money. That may have even greater value either if permit prices go up and you can just sell as an investment vehicle, or to cover your own emissions and prevent regulatory compliance costs in the future.
And yeah, I agree with that. And I tend to read these graphs in the opposite way, right? In the proportion that was bought by the non-regulated entities, which probably are speculators, or for the purpose of reselling these credits later on when the emitters need them. We see that the proportion is usually a little bit higher, not a lot higher for the future vintages. I think that gives, speculators a greater window of opportunity to find the right time to sell the product. So I think that's why they're more invested into the future vintages in a proportion than the current one. We also see, if we look at the index of degree of competition in the auction, it's usually there's much less competition usually for future vintages than current vintages. But in that last auction in August, we saw HHI, the Herfindahl index of about 1,000, which is pretty low for the future vintages. Usually it's more in the 1,500 to 2,000 range. So having one of 1,000 shows that there was a greater number of different participants that bought some of the future vintages.
It's important to highlight that the slide is on allowances purchased by compliance entities, so not necessarily the other actors that could be also purchasing the allowances. Right, I believe so. So the last slide is really just, there's always the question, is the carbon market working? We sort of looked at allowance prices, we looked at purchases by compliance entities, regulator firms, but there's this slide. We don't have any further kind of data past 2018, but this is basically the emissions inventories of California and Quebec separately in red and blue, but then we combine them, and we don't have emissions up until 2020. Maybe we have to update the slide, but I
think we could have the 2019 one. The Quebec, Environment Canada has published the 2020 numbers for Quebec, but I haven't been able to find the 2020 numbers for California. I don't know if Colin knows if they're out or when they're going to come out.
I haven't looked recently. I thought the 2020 inventory usually comes out early to midsummer, but it's been a while since I've looked for that particular data.
And we'll try and update this, but I guess that the trend is that California sort of has surpassed its 2020 target already in 2018. Quebec, the at least between 2016 and 2018, prices were going up, but together, combined, the suggestion is that they're en route to meet their 2020 target. I don't know if there's any comments on these types of graphs and what they suggest.
Well, I have a lot of comments on these, but I'll try to be succinct. I think the thing is important is to distinguish the accounting and the causality, right? So lots of things are going on, and Colin mentioned lots of them, a lot of different policies at the federal level in the United States, at the California level, and there's something similar going on in Canada. There's federal policies, there's policies in Quebec other than the cap and trade. So lots of things may explain the dynamic of the emissions, but I think what's important to recognize in the accounting is that once we've established this link, it's difficult to give a correct portrait of the situation by looking only at the emission of one jurisdiction, because probably, and there hasn't been, studies showing it yet, but probably part of the decline in California is linked to the fact that some of these excess permits from the point of view of California have been soaked up by Quebec, and part of the increase that we see in Quebec since about 2015, so since we've had the transport sector linked with the California transport sector, is probably because we could afford to purchase these abundant California credits and not reduce our emissions by our own. But so there's this interplay at work. So whether the jurisdiction are reaching their goals, I think can only be answered in the aggregate. Now, this summer, a methodology, a formal methodology has been proposed to measure the flows of permits, the net flows between the jurisdictions, so who is importing, who is exporting permits. Official numbers haven't been released. There's been talk that this is going to happen this fall. I suspect that Quebec is pushing for this to be released only after the election on October 3rd. But I think the right way to look at this is whether the jurisdictions are meeting their objective is to look at the combined numbers. It's difficult to look at the numbers in isolation, because by joining the systems, basically, I mean, it's become a partnership, right? You cannot look at the emissions of one without understanding the impact that the other has on it.
So I have a somewhat different perspective on that. I think when you look at California's early compliance with its 2020 target, I think that really primarily has to do with two things, neither of which are terribly closely related to the cap and trade market. One was that due to the Great Recession that started in 2008 or 9, California essentially started the decade of the 2010s at a significantly lower, it's called a baseline level of emissions than was anticipated by the modeling that was used to set cap and trade targets. It's one of the reasons why you have such a huge oversupply. And second, wind and solar renewable electricity, the costs came down much more quickly than anticipated. The cost of battery storage systems to make those, a somewhat firmer generation source came down much quicker. So you had a much more rapid penetration of renewable electricity into the California power grid than was anticipated. And so I think these are the main two things that led California to hit its emissions target prior to the sort of 2020 deadline year. The cap and trade market in California was always intended to be sort of a complementary policy, that it filled in the gaps and covered industrial sectors or economic sectors that didn't have a targeted policy on its own, and also provided funding for the state to engage in some programs that have a climate impact, though a lot of those programs are more kind of slow long-term investments that weren't going to get a huge amount of immediate payback in terms of reduced emissions. So I think in California we hit our target and because of things outside of the cap and trade market. And while the cap and trade market certainly did contribute, it functionally contributed as a carbon price, a carbon tax at, an $18 to $21 level, which, I certainly don't think is high enough to cause a significant price-induced emissions shift in an economy like California's. And I think most, sort of economists would probably agree. So I do agree that in a situation like the California and Quebec market, you do have to consider, the flows of permits and the linkages of climate policy and the influence of actions in one on the other. I think that's going to get even more complex as Washington State joins WCI and sort of spins up there. They're calling it a cap and invest market, but functionally it's quite similar. And I think the larger and more broad geographically an emissions market can cover, the more effective it is. But at some point, oh wow, my screen just got very weird. Are you still hearing me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well,
okay.
who needs a screen anyway? So yeah, I think with that expanded coverage, the market becomes more effective. And it's an open question to what extent the price signal from the now mid sort of $20 carbon price is going to have on California's economy. I still think it's going to be relatively low, but in some ways that's okay. If you have price signals be kind of the leading mechanism by which emissions are reduced, there's a strong risk of regressive impacts or inequitable impacts. I think given the focus on environmental and economic equity in California and much of the US climate policy right now, I think that's part of why emissions markets have been to some extent de-emphasized as a leading climate policy and continue to be a secondary policy. I mean, there's been recent research indicating that the social cost of carbon at this point is now well over $100 a ton. So, this emissions market isn't even coming close to reflecting the actual impacts. And, it under any reasonable price trajectory that doesn't cause pretty bad economic impacts, it's going to take many years before the price could possibly rise even in the same neighborhood as the social cost of carbon. So I think we're sort of looking at the continuation of the basic model of the cap and trade market as a supplementary policy and funding support for critical investment projects. The question is largely going to be, are the regulatory bodies comfortable with that being the long run role of this policy, or would they rather shift and try to sort of absorb this oversupply and get the market to being closer to the more sort of theoretical ideal of a market in which the social costs of emissions are reflected in economic decision making.
Okay, great. Well, maybe I'll just allow, we have one question here, and if our audience members, if you are so inclined, you can tap questions in the Q&A. I should have indicated that earlier, the Q&A button on Zoom. So the question is from Scott McKay. A criticism of the system in Quebec is that it causes capital leakage to California. Can we interpret this graph as showing Quebec capital being used to fund reductions in California?
Well, I think the official numbers on that are gonna come out later this fall, but my preliminary impression is that the answer to that is yes. But we have to be careful in interpreting it, because what's the counterfactual? The counterfactual is not that money would just have been free to use in Quebec, right? The counterfactual is that if we're serious about these targets, we should have done the reductions domestically. And the signal that the market is sending us is that it would have been much more costly to do these reductions domestically, right? So the question is, how can we achieve these objectives at the least cost? And for Quebec right now, the least cost is importing these California credits. So money is moving out, but it would have been more expensive if the reductions would have been done domestically.
Totally agree. The idea of a market-based mechanism is to allow obligated parties to find the lowest compliance cost and to sort of reduce overall economic impact. If you want to target investments within a certain jurisdiction or even within a certain sector, you can, but that reduces that flexibility and increases aggregate compliance cost. Whether you prioritize sort of aggregate, economic compliance cost, or whether you prioritize certain, types of projects in order to maximize local co-benefits, that's a values decision. That's a decision that, really is not something that we can optimize. It's for elected officials to make based on, what their constituents tell them. But I agree that the formal data is going to be needed to really say this for certain, but reading between the lines, yes, there probably has been a capital flow to Quebec. But I also agree that doing so has reduced aggregate compliance costs within Quebec, and whether or not you think that's a good trade is sort of up to you.
Just as an aside, some other research that we're undertaking here at UQAM and with partners, a partnership called the Joint Clean Climate Transport Research Partnership, where all Charles and Colin are involved. Some other numbers are suggesting for Quebec to meet its 2030 emission reduction target, the marginal abatement cost will have to rise to above $300 per ton. So if I go back to this other slide, on the price trajectory. So we're at about $35 per ton. So you're looking at a tenfold increase in the price of carbon if we're to do this all in Quebec via carbon pricing alone. So that's a substantial. I think the politics is something that kind of becomes kind of important when understanding the dynamics here, and what can we and can we not do politically in terms to reduce emissions in Quebec vis-a-vis California. But I also want to maybe just highlight, get the comments from Charles and Colin. I know, Colin, you probably have to leave soon. It's just the interactions between the carbon pricing on the market and the complex suite of policy instruments that are involved in each of these, because it seems like essentially what is happening, and you could tell me if this makes sense, is that the non-price instruments like the clean fuel standard, the low carbon fuel standard, and things like that in California, and increasingly similar instruments here in Quebec, are driving emission reductions, but at a substantially higher cost than what we see on the market. But that cost is not transparent, and that actually dampens, it reduces the need for reducing emissions through a market, and that kind of translates into reduced emissions, reduced prices on the carbon market. You know, that's something that you would agree with.
I think that's true, but there's a couple of sort of caveats that need to be thought about that. One is that the price of a cap and trade allowance only really reflects an actual like cost to reduce a ton if the market is sort of like well designed, is in balance. And I think when you look at the California, Quebec, the WCI market, it reflects a market where there's a structural oversupply of permits, right? That there's, because of California's sort of unexpected success and rapidity at reducing its emissions because of, you know, the Great Recession, from giving a lower starting point, plus cheap wind and solar, there's a lot of oversupply. And so to get one of these permits in a really kind of high level theoretical level, you're not actually having to pay someone to reduce. You're basically just paying to go and claim some of this misestimation made by the regulators, you know, based on data that 10 years ago was appropriate, but turned out to be not reflective of reality. Another way to think about it is, you know, these policies all are meant to sort of pull on the rope of reducing emissions, but right now there's a lot of slack in the rope. And I think that, you know, the allowance price we're seeing is, you know, sort of pulling a little bit more slack out of the rope. Eventually, when emissions, when the market has burned through or absorbed this oversupply, you will get a better alignment between the emissions allowance and the actual, you know, sort of marginal cost of reduction. It'll never be perfect because, you know, there's always inefficiencies and market failures, but it'll be a lot closer than it is right now. And so I think that's one of the questions that policymakers are grappling with. I think one of the things about price policy is, usually you want price policy to advance very slowly and gradually, because you need to give obligated parties the time to make investments, to go and find alternatives. You need to make sure that there's time for the government to understand where some people might not have alternatives, and where, you know, government supports community to protect lower income or disadvantaged communities. So price policies can be sort of the leading instrument on a climate transition if you do them slowly. The problem is, right now, given the urgency of the climate crisis and the targets we have to set to avoid, you know, going much beyond 2 degrees C globally, there isn't enough time to have that sort of gradual escalation in prices. You would have to really sort of jam on rapid price increases in a way that it would be very difficult to prevent, you know, regressive effects or broad sort of macroeconomic harm. And so I think, you know, in some ways, if we'd started doing this sort of price-led approach 20 years ago or 30 years ago, you know, back in like the mid-late 90s, when the Waxman-Markey and the Kyoto Protocol went, maybe you could have price be the leading indicator without causing problems. But that window of opportunity has closed. And so now I think the regulators, at least in California, and it seems like in Quebec as well, are doing what I think is the appropriate decision and viewing carbon pricing as a complementary measure, something that helps, something that covers sectors that don't have an explicit policy, and something that provides funding to undertake projects that otherwise would struggle to find funding from whether it's state or private sources. And so I think that's likely the dynamic we're going to see. I think it is certainly possible to get the price off the further off the floor without causing significant equity or economic harm. But to me, I don't see a real trajectory to getting the price up anywhere near the social cost of carbon within the next 10 years without risking quite severe harm. So I think the question is, how quickly is this tightening going to go? How far is it going to go? But not like, can we go back to a price-led climate policy?
Charles?
And yeah, I mean, I agree with most what Colin said. I think one thing we should not underestimate also is that there's information provided by the market through these auctions, right? They're telling us something that's hard to learn, with the other policies, which is, the constraints that the market is facing, and how costly do the agents perceive that it will be to reach these objectives, given the full package of the quantity, the trajectory of the number of allowances, and the competing policies to reduce emissions. So since mid 2021, we've seen this trajectory of increasing prices much above the floor. So we'll see if that continues. I think the further we move ahead, the further we'll be removed from the effects of the 2007-2008 recession, as of course reduced emissions in California, but also in Quebec. And I think one thing that's not really in the discussions, right? At least not in Quebec. I don't know if it is in California, but that the federal government in Canada is doing very well is compensating for these regressive effects by using the revenues of the carbon pricing for lump sum transfers. Like researchers at the University of Calgary have shown that for 80% of the consumers in most provinces are covered by the federal system, they receive more in lump sum transfer than they pay out in additional prices on goods and services that embody the carbon. And it's also generally progressive, so that 20% of people who pay more, generally represent people who are higher up in the income distribution. So I think this is not something that is done in Quebec. I don't think it is done in California, and there's no discussion in the province here right now of using the revenues to redistribute the money to the citizens. So that could be an interesting alternative.
So I have to jump off my other thing now. Apologies for leaving. I dropped my email into the chat if anybody wants to follow up. I'll say, Charles, I agree with that. I think California is doing a reasonable job of using the provisions in the cap and trade investment fund to invest in and around communities that are hit by it, though I do think there is a lot to be said for simple lump sum transfers as an equity enhancing measure, and California is not doing that yet. So yeah, thank you all. Certainly I'm happy to follow up if anybody has any future questions, and thank you, Mark and Charles, for setting this up and inviting me.
Thanks, Colin.
Very much, Colin. And I think that really kind of wraps up where we were at. We just had this final slide to thank you for your participation, and we should maybe we'll revise the slides a bit to put Colin's contact information here as well. Charles, I don't know, any final thoughts on the August auctions?
Well, I think the numbers are in line with slowing down of anticipated slowdown in the economy. So that's why the price of the current vintage is down, but a confidence that the market will remain binding in the future. So that's why the future price was up.
Okay. Well, I think we're about 20 after the hour, and we've been at it for about 50 minutes. I think we could probably comfortably close it unless there's some more questions from the audience. Maybe I'll wait just a minute to see if anyone else wants to type a question in there. We are going to try and make these auction seminars a regular event. There should be another auction in mid-November. And we will host another one of these webinars. It'll be in French, en français, in December. So please stay tuned for that if you're interested in and just watching how this market evolves and having sort of good chats and updates on the situation. So I'm looking and I don't see any other questions. So merci beaucoup. Comme j'ai dit en anglais, déjà, on va reprendre avec un webinaire en décembre en français pour faire les mises à point sur la vente aux enchères en novembre. Puis on va continuer de cette manière, français, anglais, pour le prochain webinaire. Aussi, merci à Fabrice d'avoir organisé. Fabrice est le coordinateur avec la chaire sur la décarbonisation. Donc, merci tout le monde pour votre participation.
Merci à tous. Au revoir.